as most of you know, everybody knows that she's president of Phillips, going to retire in October, and going to assume grandmother duties, I think, right, in Louisville. But anyway, we're pleased to have Nancy come back and talk with us. So come on now.
Thank you. Good morning. A quick note about, well, two quick notes, actually. Several of you have asked me about my mother-in-law, who's 98 years old and used to be my traveling companion. She is living in Louisville and is at this moment attending Beargrass Christian Church, where, as you know, my son-in-law is the pastor. And when she came the first Sunday, he said that I would be moving there soon, and that actually he was growing the church one in-law at a time. So she really is doing well and is adjusting to life there. It was really, really important to her to live in a place where her family was involved with the Christian Church Disciples. Not because she has some judgmental view of other Christians, but because that is her spiritual home, and so she wanted to be with her daughter-in-law of all people. So there we go. The second thing I want to tell you is that Phillips is doing extraordinarily well. And in fact, we have one of our larger enrollments in recent years, not where we were in the 2000s and 2005 and 2010, but coming back up. So that feels a lot better. And this past week, the Reverend Gary Kidwell, who is the retiring president of the Christian Church Foundation. The Christian Church Foundation is an endowment arm of the Christian Church Disciples, where both individuals and partner ministries like Phillips can use their services in terms of investments and protecting and growing our endowment. So our endowment is now at the Christian Church Foundation, and Reverend Gary Kidwell decided that he really wasn't ready to retire, and he's becoming the interim president. So he was here these past 2 days and got to meet everyone, and then he and his wife are going on a cruise of the Mediterranean in September, and then he'll be back to lead this extraordinary organization. Now, I tell you that only to remind you that this class had so much to do with making Phillips Theological Seminary as secure and as promising as it is today. We are on a very firm foundation, and so very grateful to Challengers and Harvard Avenue Christian Church and Bob and Harriet Peak and Chester and Debbie Cadjo and all the, and I could just, the Southards, I could just name so many people who now Phillips can look back and remember that these people decided to bet their lives, as it were, on an organization that it turned out to be worth it. So, the Board of Trustees has engaged a search firm called Academic Search. It's the same search firm that we engaged to find, Lisa W. Davison. But we had to engage a search firm so we could be sure she was the very best. And she is the very best person to be the dean at Phillips Theological Seminary. So, this search firm is helping the search committee, and they really think they'll have a president by January. So I know that you all will be as welcoming to that person as you have always been to me and Don and so many other people at Phillips, and we're grateful for our partnership with you. Okay, I'm finished being president, and now we will be how to mix up things in interpreting the book of Revelation. So let's talk for a minute. Let's start this morning by talking about the structure. Now, because it is an artistic literary work, which I have said last week, it's difficult to outline. because the structure of it goes like, I forgot we're filming. The structure of it goes like this. So it circles and circles and circles, but it is moving toward a point. So if you'll notice, the first thing is the prologue, and I read a little bit of that. The thing about Revelation is that not only is it this artistic literary work, it is also a letter. It is also an apocalypse. It is also a prophecy. So if you want to get engaged with scholars in debates about what exactly it is, I would avoid that pitfall. Just say yes. Just say yes. It is. So the prologue starts with a very formal letter opening, very similar to how Paul opens his letters to the Christians. I, Paul, writing from this, that, and the other, and this is what John does. I, John, writing from this, that, or the other, introduces himself. And in fact, at the very end, he closes with a kind of, see ya, love, John. So it's a letter. And after, wait, no, let me stop there. It's a prophecy. Remember last week I mentioned to you that John is drawing on all the Hebrew Bible prophets, particularly Ezekiel, Zechariah, 3rd Isaiah, which is the end of Isaiah, a little bit of Jeremiah, not so much. And then also drawing on the Exodus traditions. And he's taking all of that and reinterpreting it. And he understands himself as a prophet. Now, how do I know that? Because several times he refers to himself as a prophet. And a prophet analogous to Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah. Because remember, in the first century, we hadn't yet completely divided into Christianity and Judaism. So for him, it was all kind of a piece. And so he's just continuing the prophetic tradition as he understands it. Probably he was a wandering prophet, could have been a person who was not interested in wealth. Well, I know he wasn't interested in wealth. Well, he was interested, but only in telling us why we shouldn't be interested. He was probably wandered, especially working in Asia Minor, what we now call Asia Minor, which is the scene of those 7 churches, Turkey, which is the scene of those 7 churches. He probably understood, well, he does say this, he was called to be a prophet, and he was probably a person who was caught up in a prophetic circle of prophets. So that there could have been a whole group of these wandering prophets who were reinterpreting the Hebrew Bible in light of their experience of Jesus. And then were helping people see how things really would work in the realm of God. So remember last week, I also said that if we are dispensationalists, which are the persons who really, in this modern time, really understand that the revelation is a literal prediction of what's about to happen. Literal prediction. And so for them, the word prophecy means prediction. But there's another alternative. Prophecy, in the Hebrew Bible context, can mean inspired preaching. That is to say, prophets in the Hebrew tradition understand themselves to be persons who have been called by God to give distinctive messages to a group of people in a distinctive time and place, to help them become more fully the people that God intended them to be, right here and now. So by inspired preaching, they are standing in a line of persons who view themselves as somewhat distinct specially laid apart by God to speak the word with truth and power. That is just exactly what Jeremiah and Isaiah do. It's exactly what Ezekiel do. We all kind of wish Ezekiel would have shut up, but he did not, and we kept it. And so forth and so on. So, prophecy. Okay, so do you remember I said letter, prophecy, apocalypse. This is where things get weird. We can all go along with the prophets. We can, oh yeah, letter's lovely. An apocalypse is primarily a literary work that is imagining a future with urgency. And it is understanding that its source is divine, and they're mediated by some sort of heavenly being. Now, you don't hear Isaiah talk about, well, I was standing around and there was an angel that came to me and said, write this and this. In the Hebrew Bible, the tradition is to be more direct. But in an apocalypse, there's intermediaries. So there's angels all the way through Revelation who are helping make sense of this divine thing. Revelation and the book of Daniel are the two apocalypses in our Bible. But there were many more that were written. Many more during that particular period of time. Many more that were even more predictive of what exactly is going to happen. Many more that would be like spatial tours of the universe. So in one called the Apocalypse of Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah is taken by an angel into the depths of hell. And that particular writing is also a 1st, 2nd century writing, and it's where we get where Dante even gets this levels of hell. So they're going down into the levels of hell. Well, thank the Lord, those were not preserved in our Bible. They're weird, they're mean, and they would cause even more problems. And Revelation has already caused us enough. So we've got enough. Okay, I'm taking a breath. So now you have an answer for when someone asks you what the book of Revelation is, you just say yes. But you see, that's why we have to say that John, this wandering prophet, was also highly educated. This Greek in which it is written is very much shaped by a Hebrew speaker. So, for example, when Don and I were in Taiwan, even before people saw us, they could tell that he was speaking Chinese from an English perspective because of even the word order. Because we're still thinking in English and just translating it, but we're translating it according to English norms. The same is true for John. He's writing in Greek, but he's thinking in Hebrew, which makes it a very unusual and difficult to translate form of Greek, which is why in many cases your Bibles have lots of different translations. It's a very difficult piece of work, but it's also very educated. And he really does know written traditions and is working constantly with them in a very sophisticated way. So when you think wandering prophet, don't just think John the Baptist standing around and hollering at people. Think a very highly educated person who has been set apart according to his own designs and is ready to both write and preach, and writes very beautifully. Okay, now really I'm going to ask if you have any questions, because I've lost my place and I've got to find out where I am. Yeah, Kim?
Could you talk a little bit about the author?
Uh-huh.
Hello. Could you talk about the author, please?
Yes, I will say a little bit more about that. So, he says, I, John, was on the island of Patmos, no reason to doubt that he wasn't named John. Well, I mean, he says he's John, so okay, he's John. He does not say, I, John, who also wrote the writing that you call the Gospel of John. He didn't say that. And in fact, John was a fairly common name. I do not think, with good evidence, that John who wrote the Gospel is the same John who wrote the Revelation. For as a matter of fact, the Gospel doesn't even tell us who wrote that. It's just the beloved. This is certified by the beloved. You've all heard me go on and on about that more than you ever wanted to know. So this John, because the language is so different, and because what we attribute to John the Evangelist as a disciple of Jesus, this book wasn't written till at least 96 CE. It's not without the realm of possibility, as I've been reminded on a few occasions, but a 96-year-old, I mean, I know a 98-year-old was not going to be doing that wandering prophet writing quite like that at that particular time, and it's a very different work. That's all we know. With certainty, with even a little bit of certainty. With even a little bit of certainty. So, is that enough for you, Kim?
Well, I'm just thinking the Johannine community too.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, right. You can tell this woman has been also highly educated and trained. Yeah. No. Right. I think, as a scholar, that it is possible that there was a kind of Jesus follower school that were circulating around John the Gospel and the book of Revelation. There are many things that are similar in them. For example, in John the Gospel, you get a really strong dualistic approach. You're either good or bad. Well, let me tell you, in Revelation 2, you're either good or bad. But at the same time, there's a tension in which everybody comes into the fullness of God's kingdom in both writings. So you've got, on the one hand, we want everything to be as clear as we can make it. We're going to rightly divide the word of truth between the good and the bad. But on the other hand, we've got this, and yet the mercy love of God is so great that really we don't know what's good. We don't know in the end what's going to happen. So I think that's possible. There are lots of scholars who do not think that. But there does seem to me to be some affinities in the group. And because John the Gospel is also associated with Ephesus, and then we've got this letter also in Ephesus, it could have been that those particular people were in Turkey at the time, what we call Turkey at the time. One more thing about that. Both the Gospel of John and Revelation, and I'll say a lot more about this in a little bit, were written from the minority position. By the end of the first century, Paul and Peter had found their way to Rome. And much of the center of what became organized Christianity was happening in Rome. And you've got that, especially in Matthew. You have this scene in which Jesus actually hands over the keys to the kingdom to Matthew, and on this rock, we're gonna build the church. So you already have the makings of an organized religious movement that eventually becomes the Catholic Church. But don't ever think that Christians were, or followers of Jesus better, were any more in agreement with one another than we are today. As I mentioned, my sense is that the day after Jesus died and then the next day after he was resurrected, they all looked at each other and started arguing about what happened. And then began to try to make sense of what happened. So John the Evangelist is a little bit anti-Petrine, anti-Peter. John the Revelation is anti-Paul. And we'll see that more. These writings are not writings in which everybody agreed on all things. So perhaps they held to that old slogan that we disciples love in essentials, unity, in what? Oh shoot, I looked at Kim.
Don't look at me.
I know, right? You all know. Okay, never mind. I was going to make a bad joke anyway. Yeah, in all things charity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things charity. In case of agreement, astonishment. Okay? All right, so we're going back to the structure. Prologue, then the Epiphany. Now here's what I want you to note, because eventually we're actually going to look at this text in a minute. The Epiphany, the complication, and the climax, and denouement. Now that will impress all your neighbors. Just tell them you know all about denouement. That's a lovely French word. Epiphany, complication, climax, and denouement. That's where Jesus appears. And that's why they are the central moments of the work. So, in the Epiphany last week, I read to you the vision that John has of Christ that looks like a kind of angel with a lot of attributes of God mixed in, and then also some really unusual things. Today, I'm going to read you the second part of the second epiphany of Jesus, or vision of Jesus, that he gets. So think last week, angel, messenger, really weird looking angel. This time we're going to get a completely different picture of the holy. So what I'm going to ask you to do again is I'll read it, and I'll show you again the Dürer slide that goes with it. Remember, Albrecht Dürer is the German artist in the late 1500 who was presenting these woodcuts as the gospel. So if we need it a little darker, can we do it? Or is it going to be really dark and I can't read? No, can't do that. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you again to do is this is again lengthy. Remember how the first benediction, there are 7 benedictions in the gospel, in the book of John, and the first one said, "Blessed are those who read aloud and those who hear it." Oh, Betsy, thank you. I can see. That's good. Okay, does that help you see it? Because it's okay. So just relax and listen to these words. I can still see. I can still see. Oh, we have to film me. Okay. And then a voice in the dark. "After this I looked, and there in heaven a door stood open. And the first voice, which I had heard speaking to me like a trumpet, said, 'Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this.' At once I was in the Spirit, and there in heaven stood a throne with one seated on the throne. And the one seated there looks like jasper and carnelian, and around the throne is a rainbow that looks like an emerald. Around the throne are 24 thrones, and seated on the thrones are 24 elders, dressed in white robes with golden crowns on their heads. Coming from the throne are flashes of lightning and rumbles and peals of thunder, and in front of the throne burn 7 flaming torches, which are the 7 spirits of God. And in front of the throne there is something like a sea of glass, like crystal. Around the throne and on each side of the throne are 4 living creatures full of eyes in front and behind. The first living creature like a lion, the second like an ox, the third living creature with a face like a human face, and the fourth living creature like a flying eagle. And the four living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and inside. Day and night, without ceasing, they sing, Holy, 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 the Lord God the Almighty, who was and is to come. And whenever the living creatures give glory and honor and thanks to the one who is seated on the throne, who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall before the one who is seated on the throne and worship the one who lives forever and ever. They cast their crowns before the throne, singing, You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power. For you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. Well, then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll written on the inside and on the back, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals? And no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or to look into it. And I began to weep bitterly, because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or to look into it. Then one of the elders said to me, Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. Then I saw between the throne and the 4 living creatures and among the elders a lamb, standing as if it had been slaughtered, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of the one who was seated on the throne. And when he had taken the scroll, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell before the Lamb, each holding a harp and golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of the saints. And they sing a new song. You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slaughtered. And by your blood you ransomed for God saints from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests, serving our God, and they will reign on earth. Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels surrounding the throne and the living creatures and the elders. They numbered myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, singing with full voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slaughtered to receive power and wealth and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and in the sea and all that is in them singing, To the one seated on the throne and to the Lamb be blessing and honor and glory and might forever and ever. And the 4 living creatures said, Amen. And the elders fell down and worshipped. So what do you see?
Chaos.
Oh, chaos. Yeah. What do you see?
I don't know how the eyes can be on the inside. That bothers me.
Oh, I know, yeah. I don't know either. It's not biologically possible.
Of course, it says, in the next chapter it says they're both inside and outside, isn't it?
Yeah, it was in this chapter too. Yeah. How can that be? Right. Do you see the lamb? It's a little hard. For this Durer draws the lamb very small. See the guy at the top who looks a lot like Santa Claus, a.k.a. God. Do you see that? Now, on his right is an animal that looks like he has all these curls coming out of his hair, coming out of his head. That's his 7 horns. That's the Lamb. Now, one of the things that John constantly works with is a sense of irony. So John says, the elder told me, here comes the great Lion of Judah, and he turns and he sees a lamb. That's odd, and it's a tease, because there's some theological things. And remember, the elder tells John, oh, this great lion has conquered. And he looks and he sees a lamb as if it were slain. You see, there's irony going on all over the place. And that is at the very heart of much of our faith. We sing, Christ is victor, but he died. So even then, people were like, I don't know. But that's at the very heart, and John is drawing on that. Okay, what else do you see? That's John kneeling at the opening.
See the elders.
Yes, there's all those elders. It is quite crowded. And if we had time and could actually get close to this, you would see that every one of those elders is carved differently. I mean, the man's a genius, as well as very good at what he does. And you see the 7 golden lampstands around the throne, and the 4 living creatures are at the bottom of the throne between John and the God figure. Now, here's one more thing to note. At chapter 4, verse 1, John says, I looked and a door opened. For persons who want to talk about rapture, although they have to go to Paul to get that idea of the rapture, that's where they put it at 4:1. The door opened and John is taken up into the heavens. But wait, you told me they were literalists. You figured out. That's how they understand themselves, to be taken up into that. So there's John being, as it were, in a dispensationalist view, raptured. I want you to also notice the way Dürer does a lovely job of carving a German city here at the bottom. So that for in the Revelation, there is always connection with earth. There's always heaven, there's always earth. Other comments or questions? Yeah.
In front of the door at the bottom, is that face on that John is looking toward?
Yes, it is. You mean right there?
And so, is that Judas? Who is that?
Excuse me?
Would that be Judas?
Oh, doubtful. It could be someone that Dürer doesn't like. I mean, it's, of course, the imagery's open enough to see that, but not necessarily. Okay. Oh, yes.
I wanted to see all of the actual carvings. Are they somewhere where someone can see them?
Probably you can just Google them. But I actually have a full collection. I have the full collection. But they're copywritten by TCU. Oh, sorry. Well, this particular slides. I think if you just Google them, you can see them. They're in public domain, so. Yeah, right. Yeah, right. And if we were spending 30 weeks on this, Larry, we would spend a lot more time, like I have in my classes with this, because because this imagery is so overwhelming that even when I read it, it's just this and this and this and this, and so it does take time to unpack.
The remote for the projector, if it can enlarge it.
Oh, it can? This one?
No.
Oh, whoops. We didn't want to go there.
Here's 7, right here. I'll play with it for a minute.
Okay, okay. Thank you, Betsy. Any other comments or questions? Because I'm going to move. Yes. Yes, they are actually. He asked, Neil asked, why all the eyes? The eyes are a way of symbolizing omniscience. It's the holy, the divine sees everything, which is why omniscience sees everything inside and outside. And then again, the 7, because the Lamb has 7 horns and 7 eyes and 7 golden thrones. Remember last week we talked about 7 is the number of completeness and wholeness. So there's a fullness, a wholeness that goes on with that. Did you also pick up the 24 elders? Again, how many tribes of Judah are? How many tribes of Israel are there? 12. By the first century, that's a fairly standard way of talking about Israel. So there are 12, and now we've multiplied it. So 12 times 2 is 24. So some commentators will tell you that's the 12 tribes of Israel, and it's the 12 apostles. But there's a reason there are 12 apostles, and that's because there's 12 tribes of Israel, because we're playing with numbers. We're pulling these numbers and showing 12 is kind of a completeness. And 144,000 is, 12 times 12. And so now you've got a really full picture. So 12 times 12 is what's going on in that. Yeah?
Yeah, I have a question. You had mentioned the attributes or the Spirit of God. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
And that's when we do the power and glory and wealth and honor. And it comes out of Isaiah. And it's actually pretty early in Isaiah, and I'm sorry I didn't bring the exact reference, in which Isaiah lists 7 attributes. So John is picking that up and running with it. And then, of course, Handel takes it all the way home with his, worthy is the Lamb that was slain. I mean, you just heard that. Yeah. So again, we're talking about completeness, whole, everything wonderful is God. Everything mighty high is God. Okay, we have to say a few words about historical context. So we started with 3 groups of strategies for interpreting Revelation, and we spent all that time last week talking about predictive literalists. We won't spend much time this week talking about the second is allegorical spiritual, and these are the preachers. People like Alan Bosak, who was a preacher during the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. He wrote a book called Comfort and Protest, where he draws on the book of Revelation and offers his interpretation as a way of invigorating the protest movement, as well as offering comfort to those who are engaged in the protest movements. We do that every time we stand up and preach it. We're going to do an allegorical spiritual approach. And finally, I can't help it, but we will hope to stay with historical factual, which is that paying attention to the historical context, drawing everything we can know about the first century and everything we can understand about what the society and the culture were like, and then doing that interpretation work. What I can't help is I do both of them. I do allegorical spiritual and historical factual, because it turns out at heart I'm a preacher who sometimes can teach. So what I'm going to do for the rest of we have 15, do we have 15 minutes? Okay, the choir doesn't leave today, so if you were hoping to sneak out with them, you're stuck. Okay, let's really get into the context now, the historical context. It's way too boring to tell you why it is that the book was probably written in the late 1st century, around 96 CE. And that happens to be a lovely way of saying in 1996, New Testament scholars gathered from all over the world, went to Patmos and celebrated the writing of the book of Revelation. The emperor at the time was a guy named Domitian. So if we're talking about late 1st century, and I hope you'll just grant me that, then we've got to understand what is the social, cultural context. But before we can understand perspectives of Christians, we have to know about one historical event. 40 years earlier, from 96, 30 years earlier, in the 60s, Rome caught fire and burned, and hundreds of thousands of people died. And you know, there are 7 hills of Rome, and the city's organized in these 7 sections. 4 or 5 were totally destroyed. People were then cast out, were homeless. Their foods were completely destroyed by the fire. Always, whenever we have those kind of natural disasters, disease actually, explodes in the middle of that. And at the time, a really pretty crazy guy named Nero was the emperor, and Nero was one of those people who believed his own press, and so was pretty convinced he was divine, and so therefore he could do no wrong. Whatever he did, it wasn't wrong. It was the right thing to do, no matter what. But that fire caused a great deal of disruption in Rome and anger, and it was directed at Nero. And you'll see the quotation from Tacitus. So Nero, to redirect the anger of the mobs, pointed to these really weird people that followed Christus, who were promoting all kinds of impiety. And the reason they would say that is Romans understood that the world was run by many gods and goddesses, many divine creatures. So this curious and unusual group of people who followed Christus only thought there was one. Well, that's impious. And what is more, the Christus followers were not sacrificing at the temples or participating in the rituals and social customs of the day, but were instead practicing their own religion. So that's impious. And that turned out to be a really nice scapegoat for Nero. And when he pointed that's when we have the stories of those early Jesus followers being crucified in the great Colosseum and being caught on fire when they were crucified so they could be torches, and being fed to the lions. All of that comes from that particular period of time. And it was an intense period of persecution. Don't get me wrong because I'm about to tell you something that's not that it's going to change that. 30 years later, the Christ group has really grown, and they're now all over the empire. And there is no state-sponsored, centralized persecution of Christians going on in the late 90s. In fact, Domitian, although based on people's reading of interpretation, Domitian gets a bad rap. He was probably a fairly mild, by Roman standards, dictator. And there is no historical evidence that he himself promoted persecution of the Christians, or that there was any state-sponsored persecution of the Christians, not like there was in the 60s. Now, one of the problems we have is that not only do we have the book of Revelation in which Rome is the bad guy, and we'll get more into that, but it's not a description of what's happening in the 90s. John is looking back into what happened in the 60s and looking forward to what could happen again. Are you still with me? Okay. So, we have a fairly peaceful time. You've seen that scene in Life of Brian. Maybe y'all don't watch. I forgot. Life of Brian is from Monty Python. And Life of Brian is a comedy based sort of loosely on people's interpretations of the life of Jesus. But there's a whole conversation among the disciples about what has Rome ever done for us? What has Rome ever done for us? Well, Rome gave us good roads. Okay, but really, what has Rome ever done for us? Well, then we have clean water in the streets. Oh, well, we have an educational system. Well, and on and on. By the late 90s, Rome was pretty much in power, and things were, again, depending on who's talking, relatively comfortable. Now, having said all that, we have an image of a John who goes to Patmos, and on account of the witness of Jesus and the testimony of the saints. But here's what I want you to notice. Patmos is never called a penal colony in the book itself. John never says he's in prison in the book itself. And in fact, the whole idea that Patmos was a penal colony is a 19th century creation. Now, as Mike Burton reminds me, people are making a whole lot of money off of that. If you go to Patmos, you get to see the exact spot where John had his revelation. The problem is, of course, that nobody identified that spot till at least the 4th century. So how they know, and since we're people of Jesus, not people of geography, it doesn't really matter. It is clear that John is in Patmos because of his own sense of being called there to witness. But whether or not he's been thrown into prison, that's not in the text. It's never there. But we say it all the time anyway. We just do. So, okay, I'm taking a breath. We've only got 5 minutes. Where are we? Okay, then I'm going to summarize something real quick. I'll do this again tomorrow. So look, scholars pretty much agree that the book, occasionally you'll run into someone that wants to argue it was written during the 60s of Nero's persecution, but most scholars believe late 90s. Most scholars understand that it was written during a pretty ironic, peaceful time. So in that case, why was it written? Well, if they were being persecuted, it was written to comfort and hope, kind of like what Alan Bosak has to say to South African Christians. There are many scholars who think that John was talking about a perceived crisis in which he could see that all Christians were just still so traumatized by what happened in the 60s and so afraid it was going to happen again that they needed the cathartic experience of releasing all their fears and trauma by reading all of this stuff in Revelation. I don't find that particularly persuasive, even though I really love the scholar who thinks that. Here's the one I find persuasive. If this was written in a time of relative tranquility, who is John most concerned about? And I'll tell you, he's most concerned about fellow followers of Jesus. And who does he think is participating in the evil that comes to be represented by the great dragon? Christians who are doing what Paul says to do in Romans, which is obey the emperor. He was put there by God. John is like, no, do not obey the emperor. So what he's doing is building a crisis within the community. There are Christians who are really getting along really well with all of those Roman customs and gods. And John thinks that is sinful and idolatrous, and has a few things to say about that. Okay, here's my close. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail. And in that letter, he drew upon a lot of revelation to talk to white pastors who were getting along really well with the United States emperor. And he had a few things to say about those who were benefiting from this white nation in which white people were, give or take, living fairly tranquilly and were not paying attention to what was happening to our black brothers and sisters. Martin Luther King Jr. is using an allegorical spiritual approach, but he's talking to white pastors about an internal crisis in which we cannot simply say, just wait a little bit, y'all, it'll be better soon. That's the same message John is giving. It's not going to be better soon, and you all are compromising. There you go. Thanks for your attention.